Are you planning on voting in the next election? Well, I have a story, a real story to tell you. And to preface the story, I need to tell you that the real overthrow of this nation began with former President Woodrow Wilson. And it followed with a very strong initiatives to move it forward quickly and carry it out further towards socialism, Marxism, by the former President Theodore Roosevelt. This is perhaps one of the most significant periods of United States history to illustrate the beginning of the fall of this nation, commencing in the total overthrow of our republic. We need to be reminded that our forefathers and mothers suffered to give us the rights that we have put on the shelf now for many years. Lack of teaching our true American history brought us to where this nation is now, dying a quick and very painful death. We need to be reminded of the sacrifices made on our behalf. This is the story of our mothers, our grandmothers, and our great-grandmothers who lived over 90 years ago. The government was committing these atrocities against these brave and innocent women back then. What on earth do you think they're capable of doing to Americans now? Remember, it was not until 1920 that women were granted the right to go to the polls and vote. The women were innocent and defenseless, but they were jailed nonetheless for picketing the White House carrying signs asking for the vote. And by the end of the night, they were barely alive. 40 prison guards, wielding clubs with their warden's blessings, went on a rampage against the 33 women wrongly convicted of obstructing sidewalk traffic. They beat Lucy Burns, chained her hands to the cell bars above her head, and left her hanging for the night, bleeding and gasping for air. They hurled Dora Lewis into a dark cell, smashed her head against an iron bed, and knocked her out cold. Her cellmate, Alice Kosu, thought Lewis was dead and suffered a heart attack. Additional affidavits described the guards grabbing, dragging, beating, choking, slamming, pinching, twisting, and kicking the women. Thus unfolded the Night of Terror on November 15, 1917, when the warden at the Occoquan workhouse in Virginia ordered his guards to teach a lesson to the suffragists imprisoned there because they dared to picket Woodrow Wilson's White House for the right to vote. For weeks, the women's only water came from an open pail. Their food, all of it, colorless slop, was infested with worms. When one of the leaders, Alice Paul, embarked on a hunger strike, they tied her to a chair, forced a tube down her throat, and poured liquid into her until she vomited. She was tortured like this for weeks, until word was smuggled out to the press. And here's Pauline Adams in the prison garb she wore while serving a 60-day sentence. I love the story of Inez Milholland. She was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, grew up in a wealthy family, and attended Vassar College, where she was once suspended for organizing a women's rights meeting. The president of Vassar had forbidden suffrage meetings, but Milholland and others held regular classes on the issue along with large protests and petitions. She led the suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, March 3, 1913. She was draped in white robes and riding a huge white horse. In 1916, she went on tour in the West speaking for women's rights, and during a speech in Los Angeles that September, she suddenly collapsed. 10 weeks later, on November 25, 1916, she died of the age of 30. Her last public words were, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" She was known as the martyr of the women's suffrage movement. So refresh my memory. Some women won't vote this year because why exactly? We have carpool duties. We have to get to work. Our vote doesn't really matter. It's raining. I received this email last week, and it made me start realizing how important it is for us to vote. Here's a picture of the women conferring over ratification of the 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Here's another woman, Helena Hill Weed, from Norwalk, Connecticut, serving 3-day sentence in D.C. prison. In 2004, HBO released a movie called Iron-Jawed Angels, It's a graphic depiction of the battle these women waged so that I and you could pull the curtain at the polling booth and have our say. I'm ashamed to say I needed the reminder. One lady said after watching the movie that one thought kept coming back to her as she watched it. She said, "What would these women think of the way I use or don't use my right to vote? All of us take it for granted now, not just younger women, but those of us who did seek to learn the right to vote," she said, had become valuable to her all over again.